Welcome back to Cream City Social, everybody, and you are strapped in for part 2 of an interview with John Melrod, an organizer who organized here in Milwaukee in the 70s and 80s and was tailed by nobody less than the FBI. If you haven't heard part 1, hit pause, use your index finger, check the description for the link, and listen in on part 1 where we set the stage for how John ended up on a stage in Madison with a shotgun as a bodyguard for the Black Panthers. You're going to love it. And if you want even more John, he'll be here this Wednesday at Boswell Books. He'll be reading from his book, The Fighting Times, and answering all the questions that we didn't get to here. That's April 19th at Boswell Books, this Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. We'll be streaming his Q&A on the DSA Twitch channel, and I can't wait to see all of you there. One last thing before we roll the interview, a special shout out to Missy Zomber and all the people that made her victory very, very real. She defeated an out-and-out privatizer of the Milwaukee public school system who is funded by nobody less than a bunch of millionaires. A huge win for the city, and we can't wait to see what she does on the school board. Also, special shout out to Sam Harshner, who lost a close race, 200 votes, for Shorewood's Village Board. A great leader whose work I cannot wait to keep seeing. If you want to know more about Sam or Missy, we've got you covered. Check out our back catalog for their interviews. And with that, here is a very honest conversation with someone who's already made positive change in Milwaukee.
I dare picture that, yes, exactly. I'm not sure I would do it again because as I thought about it years later, to have a shotgun with hundreds of people sitting in the audience would not have been very smart.
The wrong tool for the job.
Not the right tool for the job, yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't want to make it sound like we were running around with guns all the time by any means. This was something that was particular to this incident with the Panthers.
No, sure. It just, I think it helps illustrate that these were, I don't want to say different times in a different negative kind of way, but they just were different times. Okay. Do you have any more that, well, I guess we can move on to your AMC Kenosha, the 9 years when you were writing the Fighting Times, or if you have any more interactions or perspectives of organizing with the Black community and these Black Panthers that seem from a very young age you were a part of and empathized with. What was it like working with them? Was it working with or for? Or?
It was working with, I was assigned to sell the paper, and we went to all the demonstrations for the Milwaukee Three, who had been framed up on these murder charges. But after I went to work in the factory in Kenosha, for example, we worked more with Black workers in the sense that we had two pillars that we built the Fighting Times caucus on. There was already a group when I got there of two young particular activists who had been putting out one other newsletter, Not Fighting Times, and then a couple issues of Fighting Times. So I joined with them in that, which was helpful because I think there were about 8,000 or 9,000 people in Kenosha at that point. As time went on, we identified two prongs on which we based Fighting Times. Well, of course, it was fundamentally based on everyday fights. Does a guy need a fan? Does a guy have a radiator that overheats on a fork truck and his foreman tells him you've got to drive it, and the other drivers all stop work and they discipline the steward? And, we write an article talking about, getting that steward rehired, which he was, not because of us, but he got rehired. So that was what our everyday fare.
So very specific and specific to the factory itself of these are the things we need daily basis. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's what I think any activist has to root themselves in.
I love
It can
that.
be a spill of grease on the floor. And it could be a group petition saying we want the grease taken up off the floor. Anything that makes people realize that their collective power, once they exercise it, has an impact. And the collectivity is actually very exciting to join with your other workers to stand up to the company. But the two pillars, I'd say, of Fighting Times were fighting white supremacy and fighting against racism and fighting sexist treatment of women and misogyny. And in the Fighting Times, as it became really deeply rooted among people in Kenosha, it almost became part of the DNA. In the beginning, you used to see a lot of them on the floor. And as time went on, you didn't see any of them on the floor. And we started a column called Scab of the Month for the worst foreman. For instance, a foreman who went up to two black women and pointed his fingers like a gun with his thumb up and said, bang, bang, two dead blackbirds. And he then went up to one of them and said, you're not bad looking, but you're kind of flat chested. He then, this was just the beginning. I mean, there was a middle-aged woman who he'd brush up against her behind every time he went by her, and she was furious. I don't have to put up with this treatment. In another instance, there was a black worker that he threw a 35-pound air gun at and called him a lazy MF N-word. So we created this Scab of the Month, and it became like a part of a movement. We had little round stickers, 3 inches around. And that foreman's name was Stevie Freeman. And we had a pumpkin head because he looked like a pumpkin. Pardon me. And workers in the department where I worked, in the trim department where he was a supervisor, posted him everywhere, bathrooms, walls, on his desk, on the back of his shirt. And the workers themselves made his life unbearable. 27 put their hands up, wanted to go to the nurse. 7 stewards one night followed him around like a puppy. They were like puppy dogs. Wherever he walked, they were just right behind him. So that he really was facing a lot of pressure, and of course, petitions to get rid of him. And then the Fair Employment Practices Committee came in with one of the guys in the caucus, John, and they were able to get him fired. And it was one of the first supervisors that had been fired under that kind of union pressure. So we did the same thing around issues of sexual discrimination. There was a general foreman that went around trying to hit on women in exchange for better jobs. So we called him the Don Juan Roams Again. And everybody knew who we were talking about, as did he. And I believe, if I'm right, he got busted down from general foreman to line supervisor. And the word came out in my department. A friendly foreman came up and said, be careful, Melrod. Bernie New is out to get you. And I knew that something would happen. And within a few days, I walked out to my car in the parking lot. It was the dead of winter in Wisconsin with ice and snow everywhere. And every window in my car had been bashed out with rocks, including the windshield and the back windshield. So, you know, expensive. He got even.
Yeah.
But
did you have any other casualties like that? Any other personal property get busted into or taken away?
The next personal property that I have to say that got taken away was when I was in a bar, one of the bars after work, and this I felt something poking me in the stomach, and I looked down, and it was a .38 revolver. And the guy turned to me and he said, I'm Deadeye DiMarino, and you're that fucking Jew commie. I don't like the Fighting Times. And I said, well, what do I do now to get out of this situation?
Yeah.
And I called the bartender, Midori. I said, Midori, double shots for both of us. We drank them. As soon as we finished them, double shots for us. So now we're talking about union, and I'm saying, look, Fighting Times, didn't we just write an article about the maintenance department that you're in and the loss of jobs. Yeah, that was pretty good. Well, what are your beefs? You don't have to agree with me politically on things, but what are your beefs? And after enough shots and rounds of shots,
Mm-hmm.
he was hugging me and saying, "You're my union brother," which I think is a good lesson when Hillary Clinton calls some workers baskets of deplorables,
Mm-hmm.
that people can change. They can change. And, he didn't become an angel and he didn't become a caucus member, but he mellowed out in terms of his antagonism.
Very much so. And I'm always a big believer that everyone just needs a little bit of love. That guy just needed to be heard. He just needed to hear it from you. A little bit of that antagonism gets out of him.
I think you're right.
Through all your years of organizing, do you have any, I don't want to say a formula of how to organize, but is there lessons learned that if you were younger, you'd do things differently? Did you come up with a pretty good plan of attack towards the end of your organizing days? I think that's something we're always trying to
Yeah,
find.
I mean, I believe that we did. Four of us who had been active together were elected to the top position on the bargaining committee, which was called the executive board. And people had enough faith and belief in us that at that point they were willing to entrust leading the union, which determines how their lives are going to be and what's going to happen to them. And I felt that that was on the very positive side, that, if you stick to your principles and you at the same time set an example as a militant that doesn't take shit from the company, people respect that. In terms of mistakes, yeah, I made some mistakes. I remember when we first got to Kenosha, I ran for steward and I drove three guys out to the polling place at the Union Hall with me. Next day, when I got in, I looked at the returns and I hadn't even got one of their votes. I only had three votes, including my own. So I said, well, this isn't working right. Everybody knows me because I've been out there selling the Milwaukee Worker in front of the gates and talking politics, but I got to get myself really rooted in the day-to-day battles that people are facing. Sure enough, a blizzard came down and the management wouldn't let us leave the plant early. And a lot of the guys had to drive to Milwaukee. So we passed the word, let's walk out. And at noon, a large group of us approached a gaggle of supervisors in their white AMC shirts. And we just moved through them and left and shut down that part of the plant. So I think it was doing things like that that gained enough respect that people felt for me that I was elected steward. And as steward, I decided to be as good a steward as anybody could be. I check in with the 35 people I represented every day. I made sure they knew where their grievance was and how it was being handled. I mean, these aren't the sexiest things in the world, but they're the day-to-day mundane obligations of a union rep. And traditionally, a lot of them weren't carried out by the old union establishment. So just that change had an impact on people. At later point, I was elected chief steward, which meant I was the top union rep for both night and days, and for about 10 stewards on days and 10 stewards on nights. And that position, I think, led to a number of us who had been at the core of all this work that I'm talking about were appointed to union committees, which turned out to be very, very important and became a good part of our strategy. One of the other people, John, was really behind getting the Fair Employment Practices Committee to create the momentum to celebrate Martin Luther King and to lay the groundwork in the plant for making it a real issue. Another one of us went on the political committee. And I was assigned to the education committee.
Hmm.
And it was a great opportunity because no one on the education committee wanted to have anything to do with fighting times.
I was gonna say that's right up
But
your alley.
they,
Yeah.
yeah, they kind of left me alone. I said, what can I do that's pretty safe that they won't oppose? And I designed this 7-week school, labor
Hmm.
school. And if you were on day shift, you'd meet after work at the union hall. And if you were on night shift, you'd meet earlier before work. And we had 235 people who signed up for it, stewards and rank and file activists. And every week we'd go through a different topic: how to take a time study, how to file a workers' compensation claim, then more political things like the role of women in the union. I believe we showed Babies and Banners, a film about the women during the GM sit down strike. And we had a section on how to take on multinational corporations because Renault had started to enter the picture. And everybody who had attended all but one class was awarded a diploma by the president of the union. And it was really wonderful how much pride people felt in receiving those diplomas from the union. And it just goes to show you that if given the chance, rank and file activists will participate in the union. They will come out. They don't come out when it's business as usual, nothing substantial is, talked about. They don't feel like there's any power that they have at the union meeting. It's up to those of us who believe in rank and file power and union democracy to shape the institutions that will allow people to express themselves. I became department chairman at one point, which meant as department chair, I led the meeting in our department every month. And people used to say, nobody's going to go to those. So I started putting out an agenda every month. I'd go around and hand it out to every worker in the department. When there was a really bad racist incident where the chief steward told a young white woman who was also a steward that he didn't want to hear about her kissing on a N-word person after work, and that had spread around the shop. And the young people, white young people, they didn't want to, they came to me and someone said, I don't want to be like my parents. I don't want this stuff going on. And then the black people in the department started talking about it, and I put it on the agenda. Well, about 70 people came to that meeting, and they lambasted that chief steward. I'll never forget one of the stewards who had just gotten elected as part of our slate, Jimmy Graham, who still lives in Milwaukee, and I talked to every other month or so. He got up and gave a speech, something to the effect of, look, we can't change what's in your heart, but you got to change the way you act. There's racism in both the company and the union, and we're not going to tolerate that. We don't want that to be part of the union. And he was really scolded in a way that he didn't overtly act as a racist. And people all of a sudden felt that the departmental structure, which I call the front line of democracy, the basic level of the department, was an effective tool to organize the rank and file in the department.
We do something pretty similar here at DSA where we have a socialist organizing class where it's about 8 weeks, 1 week longer than your 7-week course. But it's our introduction to organizing 101, how to have an organizing conversation, how to power map. And as I've watched 3 cohorts, as we call them, go through, I have noticed that everybody's much more engaged afterwards. It's an empowering experience where you just have to have a little bit of knowledge to have that confidence to enact that power that you had inside of you the whole time.
Which takes knowledge, and it takes education, and it takes experience. I mean, these guys I work with at Starbucks, I work intimately with a young guy named Tyler, who's out in Boston, who works at Starbucks as an organizer. And watching him learn and develop into a leader, he's been on, I think, 5 podcasts with me, and he does a great job. And it's really a new union movement. It's an intersectional union movement, as he explained to me. They don't just believe in traditional union issues. They're fighting to save the world from destruction, existential destruction of the planet. They're fighting for trans people's health rights.
I appreciate that.
They have just formed a committee. Oh, I had it from my earlier podcast today. There's 49% of the people who work at Starbucks are of color. So they just had a meeting of people of color in DC where people came from all over the country wanting to exert their power and express their particular grievances as people of color. And that's what's exciting to me about this new union movement, that it has a lot more political thrust to it than traditionally was true of most unions.
Yes, and we've talked about it on this podcast a couple times, but are you seeing a more rank and file union movement this time around instead of the over bureaucratic old unions maybe that we think about in some of these auto factories we've been talking about?
Time will tell. I think that one of the first big tests is going to be the UPS contract, which is coming up soon, because there's a tremendous amount of organizing being done to prepare people for the possibility of a strike, to get them organized, to get them active and mobilized. And I think we're going to see a real showdown because for the Teamsters, that's their biggest sector. And they've really got to keep that well organized. And I think the reform movement, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, in unity with the reform slate, just took over the official union leadership. And I think that's giving room to this new organizing and this organizing of the rank and file.
That's how I understand the situation too. Kind of this rank and file group caucus took over Teamsters and is now trying to organize on their behalf. Okay. So I'll keep letting you go if you have some more about the AMC Kenosha and your time with the FBI. But you keep touching on the responsibility that you had when you were the executive member, negotiating on behalf of your union. How do you take that responsibility as an activist, where someone could get fired from their job if you guys go on strike? You ask them to do a simple power mapping structure, try to get a tree of everybody that they work with, and then they get fired the next day for union organizing activity. How do you balance that responsibility you have on certain people's lives and the impact it can have while trying to empower them to make their lives better through a union?
I think the best example of that might be the 1985 contract negotiations, which were basically led by Raynaud. At least the strings were being pulled by Raynaud.
Mm.
And they wanted a tremendous amount of concessions in the working agreement and the contract. And it was a really tough call because myself and three of the other people who had been elected to the board had always been anti-concession. When they gave concessions at Chrysler, and then half of the workforce was laid off within the first year, we said concessions don't guarantee you jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So that had been the way we had felt and the stance we had taken. But, we all really did our homework and looked at the actual situation at Raynaud. And the fact was that they could build the two models that we were building, the Alliance and the Encore, in their unused capacity in France. So sometimes these threats are real. And as a radical unionist, you're faced with a difficult choice. Will you make concessions? And we bargained hard to try and fight to keep everything that we possibly could. I'll never forget when at one point we said that we wanted people to have the rights to their own job. Like we would bid on a job and then it would become our job. So you know what you were to do every day. The company wants flexibility. They want to move anybody anywhere they want if there's absenteeism or what have you. And the company guy responded, "You mean like cattle that know how to go to their stall at the end of the day?" So that was their attitude.
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't budging. And luckily, we had a president, Rudy Kuzel, who was a tough negotiator. And Rudy bargained about as hard as you could and got about as much as he could out of the company, which brought about, unfortunately, a lot of change in the contract. Overtime was no longer voluntary. The company gained the rights to a certain amount of days a month. The committee person system that's in the big three was instituted. Not sure if that's 1 to 250, but it's certainly more than 1 to 35.
Sure.
And right to strike was replaced by arbitration.
Mm.
And that was something that was hard to swallow because it's never something that I thought I would advocate. But Rudy put it this way when he went before the membership. He said, would you rather have a big three job or no job at all? And that was really the stakes. If we gave up what they were asking for, our contract was going to be very similar to the big three, but we'd have a job. Now, there
Yeah.
was a major cutback at that point, and I did decide to go to law school, where I then went on to do things like practice refugee law and police brutality, fighting police brutality. But my other colleagues went on and stayed at the plant and were able to keep it alive for another good decade or longer through the experience that they had gained, through all these years. So I'd say that was, they were able to get people the rights to transfer to Chrysler plants all over the country so they could get their 30 years in.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to protect the pensions of all the retirees. And there were a lot of retirees. I think I once heard some of them went back to the days of Hudson before it was even Rambler. But certainly there were Rambler retirees. So sometimes you can't just do what you'd want or what's the most radical thing to do, but you got to look reality in the face and make some hard choices and follow through on them and explain them honestly to people why you're taking that position. And that's what we did. And it became a unanimous vote of the executive board to recommend that the membership vote for acceptance of that contract, which it was overwhelmingly voted for.
Yeah, so it kind of comes down to communication. Do you have any advice on how to communicate something that's seemingly complex, where that's different than how you guys have been acting in the last 3 or 4 years? How do you communicate something like that?
In the case of that particular negotiation, Rudy was a great communicator and a great persuader
Mm,
and
persona. Yeah.
persona, and he had the respect of the membership. They knew Rudy was an honest, straight shooter, the kind that they had in the 30s when they built these unions. And when Rudy got up to explain it, he explained it in terms that people understood that he was doing this to save as many jobs as he could. And I think that was persuasive. And it was important that the rest of the board didn't start out unified, but
Mm,
ended up unified, all supporting Rudy's position. But to do that, the union has to have gained the respect of people in the plant because there's a lot of disrespect today for, quote, business unions where they send in their lawyer and their international rep to bargain the contract. And then the rank and file doesn't get to see it before there's a union vote.
mm-hmm.
In that situation, activists have to be out there educating the membership. This is what's in that contract. This is what's good. This is what's bad, and communicating that.
Yeah, and yeah, and the trust you talked about, the leader of the union having before. How was that trying to build your trust when you were in the factories? You said you talked politics when you first got there. I can imagine a college educated little white kid would have a little hard time drumming up some respect. Yeah, how'd you navigate that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll give you one example I think illustrates it. When we were on the board, we took up a collection for strikers at McWhite in Kenosha. I believe they were UAW members and they had been out, I believe, for 9 weeks. And some of them were facing evictions and some of them were facing loss of their apartments. And it was really a tough fight. And the board voted to send the stewards out through the plant to collect money from everybody. And we had beepers in those days, about 12-inch long beepers.
Yeah.
And I got a beep, and it was the chief steward in the engine division where I represented that area as a board member. And he said, I've just been fired, and so is my steward for taking up the collection for McWhite. And I said, well, just sit tight. I'll be over there in a couple of minutes. When I got over there, the superintendent confronted me and he said, these guys are fired. What for? For interfering with production, for collecting on the assembly line. I said, well, you can put them back to work or I'm going to go do the collection. So I went to do the collection and he came over and he was yelling and screaming. He was kind of one of those very loudmouth superintendents. And we got into a real verbal interchange. And people see that. They see you being willing to stand up and defend yourself and others' interests.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what made this so significant was that I was fired, but I called Rudy's house and I got Rudy's wife, Connie, on the phone. I said, Connie, I got a little problem over here in the engine division. 3 of us are fired for the collection. Is Rudy home? She says, no, he's out walking the dog, but he'll be home soon and I'll get him to call you. So he called in on the supervisor's phone. He says, John, sit tight. Within a half hour, he had assembled the entire 15-member, well, 14 members, because I was also on the board, executive board. Got them out of their fancy dinners. Some had suits on. He brought them all into the plant. And here we all were as a gaggle. Well, labor relations knew that if they didn't retract those firings, Rudy was going to do something drastic with all those board members in the plant.
Mm-hmm.
And they dropped all the disciplines. But that had taken Rudy 30, 35 years to establish that kind of prestige, respect,
Trust. Mm-hmm.
trust, exactly. And, Rudy was a radical, not necessarily politically, although he was a, supporter of the civil rights movement and, the Martin Luther King Day and all of that. But, he had grown up as just a real union militant and people knew that and people respected him for it. I don't think anybody else could have pulled off that contract with the vast majority of the membership in voting for those concessions.
Do you see? I'll let you get off here pretty soon. Thank you for your time again. But I do have a
No,
question
it's my
about
pleasure.
the militancy. Do you see that these days? Have you seen that drop off since 60s, 70s? It feels like militant is
Well,
not used very much these days.
yeah, I mean, I do think there's been a drop off, but let's not forget that the coal miners just struck for I forget how long in Bessemer, and they held tight
Yeah.
and they voted to accept, I think, the contract and went back to work. But I have a friend who worked at the big GE plant in Lynn, Massachusetts. And he told me about one of their recent struggles. He's no longer in the plant, but one of his pupils, I'd say, people that he's helped educate and help bring along, they were trying to close the gap between the two tiers. The top tier was making, let's call it $9 an hour. just for sake of an example.
Sure.
And the bottom tier was making $4 an hour.
Mm.
And the company refused to change it to 5 or 6 years. So you'd close the gap over each year.
Mm-hmm.
And this one militant on their bargaining committee was the only one to oppose it at the national meeting for GE. And it was overwhelmingly rejected because that one person had the guts to stand up. My friend said, we never thought GE would come back to the bargaining table. When they said it's a final offer, we always thought they meant it's a final offer. So there are militants that come forward. Certainly there are in Starbucks. I mean, I've been around enough Starbucks people, and, on the strike I was at in Portland, and, the woman who spoke, who had just been fired, she was what she called a wine garden representative. That means that anybody has a right to a representative when facing discipline. So she used to go to the different Starbucks when people wanted her to be there as their witness. And she had just gotten fired, and we were having a rally to demand her job back. So I can see it developing. I can see it somewhat embryonic, but not necessarily. And we'll really see with the Teamster struggle what happens, I think.
That's heartening. Yeah, we'll have to check back with the Teamsters. Anything else, John? You want to, any lessons or anything else you want to impart in us before we let you go?
Yeah, thanks for asking me that, actually. I forgot to really pitch my book.
Yeah, I know we keep
is,
dancing around it. I apologize, but
yeah. But I just want to let people know the name of the book is Fighting Times, Organizing on the Front Lines of the Class War. And if you go to my website, jonathanmelrod.com, the landing page has a 40% discount. We wanted to make the book affordable to everybody because I've been on, I don't know, a dozen or more podcasts over the last couple of weeks. And your clientele, listeners, are political. I've been on ones that are led by right-wing conservatives. So we wanted to make sure anybody who's interested could afford it. So if you go to the webpage, there's a code FIGHTING. If you put that in, you get the 40% discount. So I hope people will go out and buy it. It's a lot of people have texted me and messaged me that they're inspired by it. We've put a lot of that up on my Facebook page, quotes from AFSCME leaders in Portland saying this book has got to be read by anybody who wants to be an organizer. So people have said it's inspirational. And beside trying to leave a legacy for my kids when I was afraid I was going to die, that I only had a few months to live, I wanted to try and pass on lessons to the new generation. And I hope that this book does that.
Yeah, we appreciate that. And I can personally attest, it is a page turner. You write with good prose. It is an enjoyable read.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
We'll have the link to his book in the description. And I'm not sure if we answered the question, would you do it all over again? But I had a lovely conversation. Yeah. And you would do it all over
again. Yeah. I would absolutely do it over again. I think those were the best days of my life. I mean, the camaraderie with the other people who were in Fighting Times, the people on the assembly line, we'd have parties at my house regularly. You can't recreate that feeling that you go through when you're involved in collective struggle. And I became very, very close with two of the others who were caucus members who got sued along with me for defamation. The newsletter was sued for $4.2 million. And the three of us were called the Fighting Times 3. And we fought that battle and basically won the defamation lawsuit when the jury refused to award any damages to the plaintiffs who were suing us. Then the labor board sued the company, who had to pay about $240,000 for our back pay and our legal fees.
We didn't even get to that lawsuit. I apologize.
Someday.
We'll have to have you back on. Well, thanks so much for coming, John. And Can't wait to read the rest of your book.
Thanks a lot for having me on. And, I really appreciate it. And I'm going to meet you at Boswell's on the 19th at 6:30. So I'll see you then.
The perfect final plug. Yep, Boswell Books. John will be reading a little bit of his book for us April 19th. We'll link that in the description as well. Thanks so much,
Thanks
John.
much. Yep.